I'm Glenn.
And I'm Megan.
And welcome to Past Pioneers, where we explore events that shaped our world. Today we're diving into the story of the counterculture and women's rights of the 1960s and 70s. In this episode, we'll uncover how the world came to counterculture and women's rights of the 1960s and 70s. Let's start by understanding the counterculture and women's rights of the 1960s and 70s and why tensions were so high in the 1960s.
1970s counterculture generation was an era of a change in identity, family unit, sexuality, dress, and the arts. It was a time when youth rejected social norms and exhibited their disapproval of racial, ethnic, and political injustices through resistance and, for some subgroups, rising revolution.
Culture movement from the early 1960s through the 1970s labeled a group of people known as who opposed the war in Vietnam, commercialism, and overall establishment of conventions. Those included in this movement requested a happier and more peaceful life, and often did so by experimenting with marijuana and hallucinatory drugs like LSD.
Glenn, how did the counterculture movement change ideas about identity and community in America during the 1960s and 1970s, and how do these changes still affect social movements today?
The 1960s to mid-1970s counterculture generation was an era of change in identity, family unit, sexuality, dress, and the arts. It was a time when youth rejected social norms and exhibited their disapproval of racial different groups of people and political injustice through resistance and, for some subgroups, revolt.
An example of this is their music choice of the counterculture movement stemmed from the anti-establishment aspects of hallucinating. During the counterculture movement, attendance at hallucination rock shows exploded in numbers. Hallucination shows began to become more elaborate as the number of attendees increased. Hippie fashion was often present at these shows.
One of the most memorable music festivals during that time was the Woodstock Music and Art Festival. This very messy 3-day-long concert was the type of counterculture, from the clothes attendees wore to the anti-messages performed by the singers.
Much of hippie fashion came from their opposition to commercialism. Most of the clothing that hippies wore and was not purchased from major stores, but instead from yard sales or flea markets. Their fashion choices distinguished them from the rest of society because they wore bright colors and things that others would not wear. Their fashion was often a statement of who they were and what they believed.
The counterculture movement in support of the anti-war movement was one of the most general displays of opposition to the government policy in modern times. Protests raged all over the country. San Francisco, New York, Oakland, and Berkeley were all demonstration hubs. Especially during the height of the war in the late 1960s and early 70s, they organized protests while waving their signs promoting peace, love, and drugs. Burning draft cards were also a symbol of the movement and became iconic of the anti-war movement.
Another example of a norm that was rejected was the idea women had to submit to laws when they had no voice in their formation. Married women had no property rights. Husbands had legal power over and responsibility for their wives to extend that they could imprison or beat them with impunity. Divorce and child custody laws favored men, giving no rights to women.
Katherine, how did important people in the counterculture movement, like musicians, activists, and writers, use their voices to challenge social norms? And what effect did their work have on the culture at that time?
The music choice of the counterculture movement stemmed from the anti-establishment aspects of psychedelic rock. During the counterculture movement, attendance at psychedelic rock shows exploded in numbers. Psychedelic rock shows began to become more elaborate as the number of attendees increased. Hippie fashion was often present at these shows. One of the most memorable music festivals during this time was the Woodstock Music and Art Festival. The counterculture movement largely was in support of the anti-war movement. They organized protests while branding signs of promoting peace, love, and drugs.
Glenn, how did the events related to the counterculture movement, like protests against the Vietnam War and the rise of psychedelic culture, show a wider dissatisfaction with American political and social values, and how did these events change how people viewed authority and government?
The counterculture movement, particularly through events like Vietnam War protests and the embrace of mind-altering drug culture, demonstrated a widespread discontent with American political and social values by actively rejecting mainstream norms, advocating for peace and love over violence, and seeking alternative ways of life through experimentation with drugs and communal living, essentially signaling a desire for a more individualistic, less materialistic society than what was perceived as the established order.
This movement has created a transparent and wider viewpoint for society and made the people of society accept the basic rights of humans in society. The people in the modern age have more acceptance power than before, as these various movements of counterculture have changed the social point of the public.
Glenn, what successes did the women's rights movements achieve during this time, and how did these successes challenge the social rules of the day? How can we see the effects of these challenges in today's conversation about gender equality?
During the 1950s through 1970s, the women's rights movement achieved important legal and social changes, including the passage of the Equal Pay Act, the legalization of abortion through Roe v. Wade, and Title IV, which made illegal sex discrimination in education, basically challenging the usual societal norms that limited women to domestic roles and limited their opportunities in the workplace and education system. Despite its limitations, the 19th Amendment over the next century helped women assume a role in public affairs that would be hard to image without it. Women gradually closed the turnout gap between the sexes, and in every presidential year since 1984, they have exceeded men in voter turnout.
After the Vietnam War ended in the mid-1970s, the counterculture movement died down. However, the media continued to idolize the hippie scene. Even today, the hippie movement is often missed by those who desire to live in a more free society.
Understanding history like this helps us prevent similar mistakes in the future. Thanks for watching, joining me on History Undercover. Don't forget to tune in next time for another dive into the past.